Wes, Wesley, can you hear me?
Yeah, sounding fine, Patrick.
Okay. And you're just gonna whenever it's time, you're just gonna share your screen and do that. Is that
Correct.
the plan? Okay.
Yep.
Um, I think I don't see Andy yet, but I talked to him today, and I think I'll start, and then Andy will go, and then you'll go if that works.
Okay.
And hopefully we'll stay a little closer on time tonight. Give him a few more minutes here. And Wesley, if you want to handle the chat while I'm speaking, I guess. Or-
When you get started, Patrick, I do want to have one thing I want to tell the group. So
Okay.
when you decide to get ready, just let me.
Okay. Says okay. Let's see here. Okay. Um, can we get the recording from last week? Yes. On record. Okay. I think we'll go ahead and start. Of course, like last week, if you have any questions or anything, you can put those in the chat. If you weren't on last week, and my name is Patrick Davis, University of Missouri Extension Regional Livestock Field Specialist in the Stockton area. Wesley Tucker's on, and he'll be speaking later. And he's a ag business specialist in regional ag business field specialist in Bolivar. And then Andy McCorkle will be on here in a little bit if he's not already on. Um, and I don't see him yet, but he will be. And he is a livestock field specialist in Lebanon. And kind of like last week, we kind of this week last week was more of a general nutrition talk. This week we're going to focus more on cow-calf nutrition and management through the winter. And I'm going to talk briefly about cow-calf nutrition and body condition score management. I talked a lot about general nutrition last week, and so we're going to dive a little more deeper into cow-calf nutrition, talk more about a little bit about supplementation and putting diets together and nutrient needs and how those change and things like that. Andy's going to talk more about weaning calf management and culling cows, and then Wesley's going to kind of talk about some economics related to cow-calf management. And so before we start, Wesley had something to say, so I'll let him talk for a bit.
Yeah, this won't take but a second, but for those of you that were on last week, there wasn't a lot of questions asked in the chat. And one of the things about going to this virtual setting is we want to make this as interactive as possible. So the way you interact with us is through that chat button down there and asking your questions or asking for explanation and stuff. So I just really want to encourage you guys, if there's something that we say that kind of sparks your interest, or you want to understand more, or you have a question, please put it in the chat. And kind of like last week, I kind of came up with this on the fly, but something to encourage you to find that button. So one of the things that I'm going to be talking about later is the economics of whether it's more economical to buy your replacement females. And so I'd like everybody to go find the chat button, which should be at the bottom of your screen. As you scroll across there, you should see, the mute, the video button, the security button, participants, and you should see a button that says chat. And so I want you to click on that and chat. I want everybody to tell me whether they think it's more economical to buy or raise. So all you have to do is hit one word. All you have to do is type buy or raise replacement females. And if for any reason someone doesn't want to do that to the whole group, you can do that to chat that to me privately, even if you want to. But I want to get a vote, because when I do this presentation live, I always make the audience vote. So I want to get a vote of which you guys think before I present. So I'd encourage you to find that while Patrick's getting going. And any questions that you have for Patrick or Andy or myself as we go throughout tonight, please do put them in there, because we want to make this as interactive as possible.
And it looks like they've already found the chat button tonight, because there's a lot of.
That is a good thing. That's a great thing.
Good thing. So anyway, thank you, Wesley. And so we'll go ahead and start here. Like I said, I'm going to talk about cow-calf nutrition and body condition score management. And as Wesley said, any time this evening that you have a question, just drop it there in the chat, and we'll stop and answer it. And so basically, and last week I talked a fair bit about cattle nutrition. And so tonight, again, we're going to talk a little bit about nutrient needs and kind of put some numbers to that, and how we would go about ration development to kind of satisfy those needs. I've kind of put a little scenario together with a grass hay and a legume hay, and then kind of looking at some grains as well as byproducts from a supplementation standpoint. And then last week we talked about how we look at is our ration working, or is our cows getting enough nutrition? And I didn't focus on body condition score last week, because I wanted to focus on it this week. But we also talked about manure scoring. And so one of the things that we look at from a management of making sure that our cattle have enough energy in the diet and those kind of things, and how we can see if the energy needs are being met by that animal, is body condition score. And so I'm going to spend a couple of slides talking on that tonight, and just like we did last week with manure scoring and protein. And so with that said, Basically, when we look at nutrient requirements, and we kind of talked about this last week, but they basically differ by what you're feeding. And as we go through the winter, we probably got a couple of different types of cows, depending on what kind of operation you have, if you're spring calving or if you're fall calving. Um, if you're fall calving, you've got early to mid lactation cows. If you're spring calving, you've got late gestation cows or early lactation cows. And so I just threw some numbers up here from a book, and when I put rations together for people, this is kind of what I look at. And as you can see there, basically from lactation to lactation, intake's going to be higher, energy needs going to be higher, protein needs going to be higher. Calcium and phosphorus don't really change a whole lot, but you're going to need a little bit more in lactation versus late gestation, and then middle gestation, which you could have any one of these in depending on what your operation is in a winter for those cows during the winter. And so one of the things is because they vary, if possible, and I always bring this up, and it's really up to your operation, is to separate and feed based on requirements. And one of the reasons why we do this is to improve the efficiency of meeting those animals' requirements. Because if you're like you see here, there's a pretty good difference between a dry cow and an early lactation cow, and even a cow that isn't very far into gestation in an early lactation cow. And if we're running all those cows together and trying to feed them, in a lot of the instances, those cows that don't have the high nutrient needs are getting too fat, while the other ones are maybe not maintaining their condition as well. And so that's one thing. And then you have weight when those cows get too fat versus not. You're just kind of wasting your nutrition from that standpoint. And so, and basically another thing that comes into play here, if we've got older cows, young cows, dry cows, lactating cows, the big difference here is intake. And we talked about last week with intake varies by body size. And so these young cows, especially these young lactating cows, they require pretty much a similar amount of nutrition as your older, more mature cows. And in some instances, maybe a little bit more nutrient dense diet. And the main reason for that is they can't eat as much as those older lactating cows because of body size. The other thing is you have issues with those older cows pushing those younger cows away and those kind of things. It really it can really hinder them to meeting those nutrient needs when you're feeding those older cows and those younger lactating cows together. And from that standpoint, that's why I suggest, especially early lactation cows, is trying to feed those young lactating cows separate from the older mature lactating cows, basically because of that, and the fact that they really have high nutrient needs. And when you look at the nutrient needs, if we don't satisfy those and we don't get those young cows bred back, then all of that money that we spent either developing or buying that replacement heifer is lost because she doesn't breed back and she falls out of the herd. And really, typically, we need about 3 to 4 calves out of that cow before she pays for herself. And so that's why I really stress a lot of time is trying to feed those younger lactating cows separate from those older, more mature lactating cows, because of the fact they don't eat as much and they need a more nutrient dense diet. When we look at dry cows, the same thing can be said there as well. But basically that, so any questions on that before we move on? One thing that I brought up, or I threw this slide in here, and there's a lot of numbers and a lot of things going on in this slide, but I just want to show it to you from the standpoint of the fact, and sometimes we get into a situation where we have very cold, wet days during the winter. And over here on the far side, I guess on the right side, where it's talking about estimated lower critical temperature.
I think it's muted, so it should.
Um,
I think it's muted, so it shouldn't interfere with our voice.
When you look at this side over here, basically it shows that these cows, from an energy standpoint, can really sustain pretty cold temperatures, given that they have a pretty good heavy winter coat and it's dry. But if it gets wet, what ends up happening is that when that winter coat gets wet, they lose insulation. And when they lose insulation, they can't sustain, or they can't handle that colder temperature. When it gets wet, it's more like a summer coat, and their critical temperature is about 60 degrees. And so when you look at that, or basically that temperature, and if it goes below that temperature, basically what they have to do is they have to use more energy in order to maintain themselves, or they're going to lose body condition to maintain themselves. And so when we get some of them cold, wet days in the winter, like we do sometimes, if we don't, like, say it's, and a lot of times we'll get a cold, wet, say 30, 35 degree day, or maybe even high 30s, low 40s, somewhere in there. Let's just say 40, for instance. That's roughly 20 degrees below that critical temperature that we would say, if it goes below that temperature, then she's going to have to use more energy to maintain herself. And if this, and I'm not getting at this, like this happens for maybe a day or so, that's not a big deal. But if we have long sustained periods where those cows, where it's cold and wet, and those hair coats continue to be wet like that, if we don't increase, and over here basically on a 1,200 pound cow, you're looking at about a 2% increase for every degree that's below that critical temperature. If it was like 40 or a little less, we're looking at about a 40%, about 20 degrees below, about a 40% increase. And the thing is, if you don't increase that energy that cow's consuming during that period of time, like I said, basically you're going to lose. She's going to find that energy from somewhere, and that's going to be body condition score. And so we'll talk about body condition score in a little bit, but also during that period of time, you really don't want to lose body condition in those cows, because during the winter, because like I said, you've got cows that really they're either setting up for their high energy need, early lactation, or they're already in early lactation, or kind of smoothing through that. And we're trying to also maybe get those, especially those fall calving cows, bred during that time. We definitely don't want to put extra stress on them to lose body condition, because that's going to negatively impact our preg rate, or our ability to get those cows bred. And if we don't get them bred, they fall out of the herd. So just something to keep in mind and think about. If we get some of those long sustained cold, wet periods of time, probably a good idea to increase your energy need, increase your feed intake during that time for those cows, so that we don't lose too much condition. So we kind of talked about how they vary in nutrient need by body size, by environment, by lactation, those kind of things. The other thing you've got to figure out, and Andy did a good job of covering this a lot last week, but we've got to figure out what our nutritional resources are. We got to figure out the nutritive value of our resources, and forage test those supplements periodically, as they talked about last week. And if you buy your supplement and it's got a feed tag on it, that's a good place. But basically what we're looking for is dry matter intake, and this is what we'll use. I'll go through here and kind of put this into practice. Dry matter percentage, total digestible nutrients, which we utilize for energy, crude protein, and then we'll look at calcium and phosphorus. Although the example I've got tonight, we didn't necessarily need to add any, so that's a good thing. But sometimes if we have need to supplement a lot of byproducts, we may need to add some calcium in order to balance out our calcium to phosphorus ratio, because a lot of our byproducts or our grains sometimes will run high in phosphorus compared to calcium. So, and this is just showing that what we would kind of our feed library, you might say, or what we will need when we're putting that ration together. And so Andy kind of went over that last week as well. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can go about determining if we're meeting our nutritional needs and putting that ration together. And I'm going to show kind of two methods tonight, in a sense. Pearson Square is a pretty easy method to look at energy and protein supplementation, if we need energy and protein supplementation. And I'm going to kind of go through a quick example of that. And then looking at basically the way what I'll do from a calcium standpoint is kind of calculate based on the ingredients that you have in there, kind of look and see if you need to add any calcium or not. In most instances, you're not going to need to add very much. And so when we put a ration together, a lot of times we'll just kind of reduce the corn content of the supplement in order to add that calcium in. But as we'll see in the example tonight, we didn't necessarily need to add any, but that's, you'll basically just calculate out if you need to add it or not based on what the ingredients are that you have in there. And then some other methods, and I've done this before, is just use a straight Excel spreadsheet, looked at the requirements, looked at the ingredients that I'm adding in at the rates I'm adding them in, and then determine, do I have enough total digestible nutrients on a pounds basis? Do I have enough crude protein on a pounds basis? And then calcium and phosphorus, and do I need to make any adjustments, or do I need to add any supplement in? And then there are some cattle ration balancing software programs. But if you can either work with one of us, either Andy, myself, or your local livestock specialist, and we'd either use Excel spreadsheet, Pearson Square. We do from time to time using cattle ration balancing software. Those kind of get kind of expensive, and sometimes they're kind of hard to understand. And so I've kind of went away from using those and just more use an Excel spreadsheet, looking at, are we meeting those requirements or are we not, based on what our ingredients are and what we're feeding. And so basically here's how I would start, and this is Pearson Square here, and basically you got a square, and in the middle of that square, we use the requirement that we showed earlier for an early lactation 1,200 pound cow. She needs roughly 58% TDN in that diet. And we said earlier that she needs to consume about 30 pounds of dry matter. And so basically, first thing I do is figure out, and what I did is I calculated the TDN. So here on the left side of the square is the percentages of the TDN for the hay. And what I did was basically I assumed that we were going to feed daily. We were going to feed roughly at a time two fescue bales and one red clover bale. And basically, depending on what your hay situation is, you can adjust that however. But that was kind of something, basically a grass hay with a legume supplement. I mean, you could throw alfalfa in there and it would change it differently, because alfalfa is probably a little bit more TDN possibly than red clover. But you saw that back on that back slide. But anyway, that would be the TDN for that composite. And then what I did was our supplement, I basically said we're going to have a third corn, a third distiller's grains, and a third soy hulls. That's a pretty common, that's a pretty common commodity blend. Some people might put corn gluten feed in there. I'll actually show you here in a little bit. You may not necessarily need all of those things based on this particular scenario in there. You may just be able to use one of those ingredients and feed at the same rate. Because as we showed earlier, this is 86% TDN. Well, corn and distiller's grains both run above 86. Soy hulls runs below a little bit. And so we'll kind of, as we go through this, we'll kind of hit on that here in a little bit when we look at, did we meet our energy and do we need to supplement protein? But basically what you do on the Pearson square here is you subtract across the lines. And so, and then on the other side you have, and they call them parts, but I used forage, and then the supplement, the forage is on the top, which is the fescue and the clover mix, and the supplements on the bottom. And so roughly in your ration to meet that 58% TDN, you need about 28 parts forage to about 5 parts supplement, which roughly equates to about, they're going to consume about 85% forage and about 15% supplement in their ration. And I actually went over here and checked my work, I guess you might say, to make sure that we came up with pretty close to 58% TDN. And when you calculate that out, you do. And so that looks good. Now, this is where what I was talking about. So when we go and we look at protein, our hay more than satisfies our protein need. And this is common with, especially if we're feeding a higher quality hay or supplementing our legume with, or supplementing our grass hay with our legume. In a lot of instances, with our cool season grass hays and legume hays and the mixtures there, in a lot of instances, we meet our protein need. I think I mentioned that last week, that protein's not necessarily our biggest need, usually energy. But and so when you look at that and you've met your protein need, that really means that basically what we're looking at is, did we meet our energy need? Not necessarily do we need to add anything to meet our protein need, because sometimes we might need to add a little extra, a byproduct that might be a little bit higher in protein in order, that is also high in energy, in order to maybe satisfy that protein need, which dried distillers grains and solubles is that typically that supplement. And so, but in this case, we don't need to necessarily do that. And so when you go back, and this is kind of when we back up here, and that's what I was getting at before, is corn and dried distillers grains and solubles are both above 86% TDN. So in that case, I mean, one is, if we back up to the nutrient profiles here, one's 88 and one's 96. So technically, if we took the soy hulls out and we just fed either one of those ingredients or the combination of those two ingredients, we'd actually probably feed just a little bit less. It wouldn't be a lot, and probably not enough to necessarily make a huge difference. But the thing about it is, when you look at cost, and I think we talked a little bit about this last week too, look at these on a cost per TDN unit basis. When that's the case, you want to build that ration based on that cost and look at the cheapest ingredient. And in this case, we don't need any extra protein. And so we can then look at in any of those individual ingredients, and we're not, and I'll get to negative associative effects here in a little bit with corn, but we're not feeding enough corn to these cows that's going to be an issue. So I guess what I'm getting at is, because we don't have a protein deficiency, we don't need to necessarily add an extra ingredient. We can actually feed any of those two ingredients either by themselves, corn or distillers grains, and still meet that need and not have any really negative issues, depending on what the price is. And some people may have the corn in the bin to do it, and not. And in that case, you don't necessarily need to add anything else to it. So does that make sense? Any questions on that? I might have fumbled through that a little bit, but just kind of wanted to make that point there that we could either feed a blended supplement, or in some instances here with two of these ingredients being above that 86%, we could actually feed those individually and not need to blend the supplement, I guess is what I'm getting at. So any questions on that before I move on? Moving on, so is our calcium to phosphorus ratio correct? And from a pound standpoint, we're well above our requirement on both of those. And when you look at the calcium to phosphorus ratio, we're above that 2-to-1 ratio, and so we don't need to add any limestone. But if we needed to do that, it would either be limestone or calcium carbonate that you would add to that diet in a small amount in order to satisfy that need. And if we needed to do that, we would just reduce down either the corn or the distilled, probably the corn, in order to make that happen. So now that we know how much we're feeding from a dry matter standpoint, I think Andy brought this up last week, but now we've got to figure out how much we're actually feeding. And I basically convert from a dry matter standpoint to an as fed standpoint with the hay there at 88% dry matter, converting that to so many pounds as fed, or the actual amount, or add back the water. And then on top of that, we're going to waste some of that hay. And I put in there 15% wastage. That's kind of up to your operation and what you think your wastage is on that hay. I've had people tell me their wastage is less than that, but that's kind of a good common number that I threw in there for wastage. And so when we look at that, we're feeding roughly 34 pounds of hay. And then when you get down here to the supplement side of things, I just accounted for about 5% wastage on I added back the water and accounted for 5% wastage on the supplement side. And so that's roughly about 5.5 pounds of feed per head per day. And so that's just kind of a good common all-purpose way to kind of calculate this and see and kind of show. And so this would be what you would probably actually be feeding depending on what your wastage level is. And so to those 1,200 pound cows during an early lactation would basically be that first 90 days of lactation. And so some other feeding considerations, when we look at our mineral or trace mineral or vitamin supplement, we talked a little about that last week, but just thought I'd bring that up again, and basically provide free choice, use organic trace minerals because of their bioavailability. That's going to improve their ability to be absorbed. And if you're going to feed them, you might as well use the organic ones and get more absorption out of them. They're going to consume approximately 4 ounces per day. And basically work with your local feed dealer to find a mineral that's going to satisfy those cows that you're feeding where they're at, and take into account, like if you're feeding a lot of supplement, especially byproduct supplement, you're probably going to want to feed a mineral that's pretty high in calcium compared to phosphorus. And a lot of times they have a mineral like that. So, one thing that I would suggest if you're supplementing cows, we'll talk about this with stockers next week, but is including an ionophore in there. And with cows, Rumensin's the main one you would use. It's going to help reproduction. It's going to basically what Rumensin does. It has various functions, but probably from a cow standpoint, it's going to improve energy efficiency of that cow. So it's going to help improve performance of that cow, help maintain condition. When you look at replacement females, it improves gain and improves reproduction, those replacement females. And so it just generally improves energy efficiency of the animal. And it's pretty cheap to incorporate in there. And so, you'll see it some in minerals, but you can also cheaply put it into a supplement as well. And I mentioned this earlier with the negative associative effects of starch, and I think I talked a little about this last week, but bottom line is you don't want to feed more than 5% of their body weight, or 0.05% of their body weight in starch, which is corn, wheat, starch ingredients, because that can negatively impact the fiber digestion bugs and the microbes in the rumen. And by negatively impacting those, that'll affect your intake and your forage digestion. That can affect performance of the animal and those kind of things. And so you just want to try to stay away from doing that. And in this case, in this particular ration we put together, that's not an issue. Now, if you were feeding more supplement, then even though you could probably hit that energy need with corn, you may want to split that with corn and distillers if you're having, like, say, on a 1,200 pound cow, having to feed more than 6 pounds of corn or something like that. So that's fine. So that's something that when we have to feed high levels of supplement, we put those we can put some of those byproducts in there, get that energy, and not go over that 0.05% of their body weight and starch issue. From a high sulfur byproduct standpoint, no more than 40% of the ration on those, and that would be things like corn gluten feed and dried distillers grains and solubles. You just don't want to feed too much of those because, and with cows, it's probably not as big of an issue, but we might run into some polio and some other issues with that. Probably more of an issue with stockers we talk about next week. And then nitrates. And if you're, this is especially something with sorghum, Sudan grass, Johnson grass, pearl millet, stalks, silage. A lot of times with silage, that ensiling process is going to reduce that nitrate level in there. So sometimes we, even though it's high when it goes into the silage pack, when it comes out, it's low enough that we can feed it. But if you're feeding forages like that, and if we've had a drought when those forages were baled or harvested, you may want to check those, and you may want to check those and see if they're high in nitrate, because high nitrates, even at a low level, can affect reproduction in cows. A lot of times we associate it with nitrate toxicity and death in animals and things like that. But even at a low level, high nitrates can affect affect reproduction in cows and cause them to slip calves and those kind of things, and abort calves. And so that's even at low levels. And so especially with your late gestation cow, pregnant cows, or trying to get those cows pregnant, you want to watch that pretty closely and make sure you're not feeding something too high in nitrate. So, and then,
Hey, Patrick,
yeah,
you were referring to phosphorus earlier and stuff. So we got a good question that just came in.
Okay.
So the question is there an equation or some kind of conversion that can show from all the phosphorus and potassium that this individual puts on their alfalfa to grow their alfalfa? Is there some way to calculate how much of that will end up in the cow when I feed it? Because it appears what may be good for the alfalfa is overkill to meeting the nutritional needs of the cow. So it's an interesting question about thinking.
It is an interesting question, and there might be a calculation. I don't know of it. I would have to talk to some people and find out. I would probably lend that more because the second part of that question, could it be overkill for the alfalfa versus the cow? And the thing about that is we want to make sure from a and I'm not an agronomist by any means. That's not my area. I do a good job of telling you how you can feed it, but telling you how to grow it, no, I'm not that. But the thing is you don't want to shortchange. My feeling is you don't want to shortchange those plants of those nutrients, because those nutrients are important for growing those plants, and so even though it might be overkill for the cow, and I don't know that to be the case, you don't want to shortchange those plants from that standpoint, because that's going to affect your growth of those plants and your hay production and those kind of things. And so, sorry, I can't answer that question any better because I don't know for sure about those calculations.
But it is an interesting question that you probably could find out the phosphorus content in the alfalfa and figure out whether that would affect what kind of mineral you needed to be feeding. Whether you
that is true. Actually, and that's you bring up a good point with alfalfa and some of these legume hays. If I'm feeding a lot of alfalfa, sometimes I actually phosphorus. There's such a there's such a high calcium to phosphorus ratio in those, and in some instances, sometimes I may even have to add a little bit of phosphorus in those diets below, and not necessarily. I can't remember if it's cows or if it's stockers, but there isn't a lot of phosphorus. I know in particularly in alfalfa, there's not a lot of phosphorus that makes it in, and I believe sometimes I may even have to add a little bit if I'm feeding a lot of alfalfa. Now, we don't typically feed a large amount of alfalfa to our cattle. We use it kind of as a supplement to supplement a poor quality hay, or that's how I would suggest using it, not feeding them straight alfalfa from a forage standpoint when we're haying our cattle through the winter. But I could definitely look at that and see on some calculations and see what that looks like.
So we also had another question that asked, is the starch supposed to be limited to 0.5% or 0.05% of the dry matter intake?
I'm thinking 0.5%. I may have done that wrong in the slide. It's 0.5%. It's basically on a 1,200 pound cow, it's 6. I did that wrong on the slide. I'm sorry. It's basically 6 pounds of corn for a 1,200 pound cow, or 3 pounds of corn for a 6-weight calf. That's what it is. So, and that's on a dry matter basis. So it's actually more than that, but you want to kind of, and that's kind of a good rule of thumb, I guess you might say. Not to say you can go over that a little, but you're probably going to impact your fiber digestion just a little bit. And that's one of those things that's just kind of something that I always learned and kind of sticks in there. And that's kind of like a base point where I say, okay, at this point, I probably need to switch from corn and put something else in there. But yeah, that's actually should be 0.5%. So a body weight. Any other questions, Wesley?
Nope. Looks like that's it at the moment.
Okay.
Good questions, guys. Good questions.
Yep. Thank you. And like I said, we talked about analysis of the feeding program. We're going to talk about body condition score here in a few slides, but then we have also, and I talked about this last week, so I'm not going to spend much time on it, but body condition score, we look at that from an energy standpoint. Fecal manure scoring, we look at that from a protein standpoint, or a total digestible nutrient standpoint. And so those are the two things that you look at to say, okay, I put this ration together. Are my cattle actually performing correctly on it, or do I need to make adjustments? And so I throw this cow up here. She's a 5 body condition score. The main thing we're going to look at from a body condition score standpoint is it's basically a evaluation of fat cover. And so fat cover over the backbone, the tailhead, the hooks, the pins, the ribs, and the brisket. And when we look at that, we're basically from a 1 to 9 scale, and we want to be in the middle. If we're a 1, we're really thin, skeleton's visible there, 1, 2s, and 3s. You can see a lot of bones on those cows. 4 is kind of borderline. I'll show that here in the next slide. But we can still see ribs, backbone are visible, hooks and pins are prominent. We don't want to go below a 4 because if we go below a 4, it takes a lot of nutrition to get her back to where we want her to be at calving time, which is optimum of a 6. And so that optimum range, and really 5s and 6s is where we want them back. 7's all right, but if we're really supplementing and we've got a lot of 7s, you know, we can back that supplement off a little because we're really not getting a whole lot of bang for our buck by pushing those cows to a 7. So for kind of the optimum range is borderlines of 4, kind of our optimum range where we want to keep those cows are 5s and 6s. And basically we're going to have our fat cover, our ribs are going to be covered, the backbone's going to be covered. There's going to be some fat starting to deposit around that tail head and in that brisket, depending on if we're at a 6 or at a 7. And we'll kind of show the 5 and the 6 here in a bit. Now, if we're up to an 8 or a 9, which is basically just square fat down their top line, full through the brisket, at the tail, I mean, just square. If you think of a square cow down her back and those kind of things, basically we've overfed that cow and we're really wasting a lot. We're wasting our energy, or we're wasting our nutrition. And especially if we're supplementing that cow, we're wasting our money. And actually we get to that 8 and 9 level, we're probably going to negatively impact reproduction from that standpoint too. So we may be to the point we can't even get that cow to produce any calves at that point. Basically each body condition score is approximately 75 to 100 pounds. So like I said, we kind of want that cow to range. When she's down at a 4, we need to put about 200 pounds back on her to get her back to a 6 prior to calving. And so this is the range. And basically, like I said, we want a body condition score 6 at calving, especially those replacement heifers, because like I said in the initial talk, they have a lot of things going on nutrition wise. They don't eat as much. They're going to be lactating for the first time. They're going to be lactating for the first time. They're going to be repairing their reproductive tract. We're trying to get them bred back. All those things are going on. All those things require energy to do. They're still growing. And so we want, and the thing is, we want to put her in the best chance to breed back and stay and be at a body condition score 5 at breeding on those first calf cows, those replacement heifers. And so that's why we want her at a 6 at calving. So she has that opportunity if nutrition is tight on her, that she can lose one body condition score and still be in that 5 range where she still has adequate body condition to become pregnant and be maintained in the herd. So you can see here with the 6, moderate condition, flesh over the top line there, over the tail head, full flesh there in the flank and in the brisket. Can't see any ribs showing or anything like that. Good fat cover over the ribs. We move down to the 5, which, as I said, is kind of your optimum body condition score to become pregnant. And again, you start seeing a little bit of ribs, not much. Definitely not as much fat there over the tail head and over the hooks and the pins there. Not as much in the brisket. And then then we move to a 4. And as I said, that's kind of our borderline. And you start to see more ribs. You start to see more bone there over the top line, over the hooks, the pins. Don't really see any fat in the brisket area. But basically, there is still some fat over the ribs and over the hips. But you can really start seeing rib on those cows. And the thing is those cows get to that condition score, and those calves are big enough to wean. And Andy will talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. Probably need to get those calves off those cows, because basically, like I said, prior to the next calving season, we really need to put about 200 pounds back on that cow. And the thing is, and the other issue with this is this cow, she's a body condition score 4. she's probably not providing that great of nutrition to that calf. That calf's probably getting a lot of nutrition from the grass and other stuff around as well. We pull that calf off, we can feed that calf and improve its performance, and we can also improve that cow's performance because we pulled that suckling stress off her, and she'll bounce. She should bounce right back and start putting condition back on and start getting ready for that next calving season. The other thing with this body condition score for cow, if our cows seem to end up down in that body condition and don't maintain very well and don't build back body condition very well after we've weaned that calf, that's probably a cow that probably needs to find a new home or needs to be culled. And Andy will talk about that later. But the thing is once we get to that condition, if that calf's big enough to wean, we probably need to go ahead and wean that calf and separate them and start working on both of them to get better performance in them. So, any questions on that before we wrap up? So to kind of wrap up here, like I talked about earlier, we're going to feed these cows based on their nutrient requirements. And so sorting those cattle into kind of feeding groups, could look at lactation versus dry, and then body size, age as well, and kind of sort those and feed them based on their nutrient needs. It's going to help you be able to give a little better nutrient dense diet to those younger cows that need it, and kind of be more efficient about how we provide the nutrition to those cows and not waste so much nutrition. And hopefully that improves the operation profit potential. We've got to determine their nutritive value of those feedstuffs and then determine if that meets what we're feeding. And that includes, we've got to have some sort of either analysis, forage test, test of our supplements, those kind of things, to know what we're feeding and know if we're meeting those nutrient needs, and then adjust accordingly. And the thing there is, you need to, from an economic standpoint, I talked more about this last week, but look at those supplements from an economic standpoint. Look at them on a price per unit of dry matter, total digestible nutrients, and kind of shop a little if you can. Sometimes that requires some things that maybe operations don't have the financial to do, but if you do, kind of shop a little and kind of get the best bang for your buck. And then, as I said, we want to use that body condition score. We want to look at performance of those cows, want to look at the manure score, and see how are these animals performing on these diets. And really, record keeping is very important here, and I didn't talk much about that tonight, but that's an important part of this to determine, are those cows maintaining their body condition? Are they performing properly on what we're feeding them? And identify those cows that are and maintain those. And as Andy will talk about later, those cows that aren't probably need to find a new home. And the other thing is, you kind of use this from another standpoint, is if we've got a lot of cows that aren't performing right on what we're feeding, maybe we need to adjust what we're feeding as well. So with that, there's my contact information. And of course, if you have any questions or need any help related to rations, or you can contact myself, Andy, if you're in Andy's area, or your local livestock specialist should be able to help you with that as well. So with that, I'll entertain any questions, or we can move on to, hopefully Andy's on by now.
While you're getting that switched over, Patrick, I will just mention we had a couple of people log on after I had made this request. For those that were just a little late getting in, I'd like you to go to the chat box and enter whether you think it is more economical to buy or raise replacement female. So all you got to do is type in buy or raise. And one of the reasons why I would like those last couple of people to enter is because we're almost in a dead heat right now. We are 8-9. I won't tell you which way, but we are 8-9 on the vote. So I'd like to get the last couple of people voted in there if I could. I'll shut up and turn it over to Andy.
Andy, are you on?
Yeah, I'm on.
Okay. Do you want to just share your screen, or you want me to
If
handle
we can make
that?
it work, yeah.
Okay. Are you going to share your screen then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh, okay, does that look right, Patrick?
I just see you. I don't see your screen.
What do I need to tell it to do that? Maybe you had ought to just do that.
Okay. Here.
So Andy, if you just push that green share screen button, and then it'll pop up and it'll give you a choice of which screen you want to share. And you can select which screen you want to. And then once you pick which screen you want, then you go ahead and hit the button that says share screen. There should be a little blue button there in that window.
I'm seeing who can share. One participant can share at a time. It's not.
Only
Oh,
one
here we go.
participant at a time. Multiple.
Try that. Did that work now?
I think you're getting her there.
Yeah. There
Good
you
job.
Go. Now put it in presentation mode.
There we go. Now it finally did it. Okay.
Okay, that works.
Okay, so I think most of you are on tonight. I believe we're on last week anyway. I'm Andy McCorkle. I'm another livestock specialist, and I kind of cover the eastern half of Southwest Missouri, where Patrick does the western half kind of anyway. I'm based out of Lebanon now, but anyway, I'm going to kind of talk mostly about about some weaning management type of things, a little bit about that, and then we'll get into some calling decision making later on in the talk too. Then anyway. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to talk about was kind of thinking on the lines of bottom line is just do it when it comes to weaning. Anyway, we talk an awful lot about preconditioning programs, and basically what that is it's a set of management practices that revolve around proper weaning, and hopefully our ultimate goal behind all this is getting that calf ready to be productive and be efficient later on down the animal chain when we get it into the feedlot and the like there anyway. And that really what we want to do there, or what we're after, is trying to reduce the amount of morbidity and mortality, those animals that get sick and those animals that ultimately die, even for that matter anyway. So a lot of times the things that you'll see listed in various preconditioning programs, of course, is the true weaning itself, and that maternal separation, getting the calf away from the cow and getting it used to living on its own, basically kind of getting the ball out of it. And vaccination is another big, critical, important part of a good weaning program. And then we've got to think about the nutrition of that calf in general anyway. And we'll talk about that really more kind of when we talk about stalker stuff next week, really, than what I will tonight. But like I say, we'll hit on it a little bit anyway. But we've got a lot from a nutritional standpoint. We're basically trying to teach that calf an entirely different way to live than what it has. It's been in its mother's side, living off of milk and what grass it picks out of the pasture anyway. And here we're trying to basically reverse that and put it on almost full feed and ultimately on full feed then anyway. And so like I say, there's a kind of some specific management around that we need to work around too anyway. And those last three on there, castrate, dehorn, and deworm, obviously those are things that we want to look at when we look at a preconditioning program as a whole as well anyway. But really what all these things really kind of come down to is helping us identify and deal with those stressors that can potentially lead to sickness later on down the road. And we want to try and spread these events out over a little bit of time. from a management standpoint, the earlier we can castrate our bull calves in their life and make them into steers, the less stressful it's going to be on those animals. And so we want to think about that. Dehorning is the same way. I mean, the quicker we can knock those horns off, the smaller that they will be, and it'll be easier on the animal that way too anyway. So like I say, the earlier in life that we can do those two things, that's two kind of big check marks that we take off of our list of potential stressors around that weaning time frame there that can really help improve the outcome of our weaning process there too. And deworming, again, we'll kind of talk about that along with vaccinations a little bit more later on down the line there anyway. It's kind of one of them, bottom line is we just want to do it. Okay, so
The beans
Oh.
get real,
go ahead.
the beans.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we want to be able to make this pay for itself. We don't want to do it just out of the goodness of our hearts, although it is the right thing to do. We want to, when we do things from a business standpoint, we want to try and make sure that they make money as well. And so one of the things that often happens, I won't say always, but often happens is cattle buyers like to buy cattle that are going to be successful. They don't want to have to deal with a lot of sickness and death situations any more than what we do at home, for that matter, anyway. And so a lot of times they will pay more money for those animals that have a documented history in their life. You know, what those things that revolve around genetics and animal health and all of those kind of things like that anyway. And so like I say, that's really one of the kind of the primary reason why we do this is to help make more money anyway. And this Hilton and Edel, that was some research. It was a compilation of about 11 years worth of calculations anyway. And they looked at preconditioning programs that had been associated with one particular research farm anyway. And the average over that 11-year period, surprisingly, was about $70 a head profit that they got out of those calves by sending them through the preconditioning program. And their very minimum was $26 a head. So even at that, you're still, I mean, even in the worst of times, you're still making money by doing it. But ultimately, when they looked at the research, the premium that you receive for the preconditioning, really, it wasn't always profitable. And even when it was a pretty small component of those profits. And about 2/3 of that added value that we get out of preconditioning programs comes from the weight gain that we hopefully put on those calves while we're preconditioning there anyway. And so that kind of shows the importance of a weight gain in there. And again, that kind of, we'll hit on that more next week when we talk about the stockers and backgrounders and actually the value of gain and that kind of thing anyway. But that's kind of, I put that in there to kind of get you to thinking down that lines from a weaning management standpoint too, that it's one of those things that can potentially put several more dollars in your pocket. Okay, so let's kind of hit on the vaccination stuff here really quickly. And I put in big bold letters at the bottom of this slide that you really need to consult with your veterinarian for your individual situation. You know, no two individual farms are exactly the same, and there may be some sort of a problem that has historically popped its head up on your farm that maybe others in your area haven't had issues with anyway. But this is kind of what you see there is kind of a broad, basic kind of a guideline of the things that we really want to try and look for there anyway. Obviously, our respiratory distress type of stuff anyway. We sure want to hit on those things and avoid shipping fever type of issues. And then on the bacterial side, of course, we've got Vibrio and Lepto and Clostridia. Most of you are familiar with that, and call it your blackleg shot is what the kind of the common layman's term for the Clostridia vaccine there is anyway. Deworming, that's another one of those things. Like I said earlier on, why we want to make sure that we get these animals free of parasites or as close to free of parasites as what we can, because they'll perform better when we don't have basically leeches sucking off of them, kind of in a sort of a vague term there anyway. And then I put implanting on here as well. Implants, Patrick mentioned earlier about ionophores, and implants are kind of the same way. Those two things are two things that can really kind of crank up our feed conversion, and they're almost the equivalent of giving ourselves a free lunch, and you might say there anyway, or not quite free, but almost free anyway. And so that's one of those things that used to be fairly common, but a lot of folks have gotten away from using the implants, and we want to kind of think about implementing a strategic implant program there anyway. And that's another one of those things that a vet can kind of help you out with there as well anyway. We talked about kind of some of these other things you might need here. Brucellosis. Now, Wesley kind of brought up the point about replacement heifers there anyway, and I kind of fall in the camp of, although Missouri is considered a brucellosis-free state, and technically we don't have to vaccinate against brucellosis anymore, if you even have an inkling that that heifer might potentially become a replacement heifer and a cow on your farm or someone else's, I feel like it's a pretty good idea to go ahead and do the brucellosis vaccination, just kind of as an added security, because all it takes is one person messing up and sneaking an animal into this state in the dark that is a brucellosis carrier, and we have to start things from the beginning again there basically. And besides that, they put those nice little metal ear tags in their ear that give you an extra form of identification. They do occasionally fall out, but not near as often as what a dangle type of an ear tag does. And so like I say, it does kind of give you a backup form of identification as well there anyway. Okay, and always when we're administering any type of a vaccination, we want to read the label and make sure that we're doing it right. I was doing a program with a veterinarian here a year or two back anyway, and he mentioned about that even though he does this for a living, one of the first things he does before ever giving an animal a shot of anything is he reads the label, even though he's read that label countless times again, just to remind him and keep it fresh in his mind of what it is that he needs to be doing, and like I say, to make sure he's doing it right. I put this question in here, debate about subcutaneous versus intramuscular vaccinations or any sort of a shot. And if we're given the option or alternative to select between subcutaneous, basically under the skin, or intramuscular in the muscle, why we always want to go subcutaneously, mostly because of injection site lesions that can potentially pop up with giving shots in the muscle. Now, there are some types of medicines that will administer that will need to be given in the muscle, and the label will specifically say that anyway. And so we want to be careful about where we give those when we do have to give them. And we'll talk about that here in another slide or two again. But again, pay attention to the withdrawal periods on those. That really falls in play with antibiotics in particular is where we think about that the most anyway, and other types of drugs too, but antibiotics is the one that really kind of comes to the forefront the most there anyway. But again, that comes back to reading the label and make sure you follow that label to the T there anyway, because believe it or not, they do have checks in place, and they pull random samples out of the line at packing plants looking for residues from various drugs in the meat that's on the counter anyway, and they find ways to track you down. If they find residue, they are going to find you and see to it that you know that you're not supposed to do that anyway. So like I say, keep that in mind too. Okay, so this picture that you see in front of you here, I put that in there kind of to hit home the point about proper injection sites anyway. And when we're administering any sort of a vaccine, this area that you see here kind of in the blue shade, and then the smaller one for the green there as well, that's the area that we want to try and shoot for hitting our animals with those injection sites. That's an area that there isn't a whole lot of usable muscle in that neck there, for one thing anyway. And so and there's also some extra skin for subcutaneous shots in here as well anyway. The blue triangle you see that comes from more or less in front of the point of the shoulder here up to kind of slightly behind the ear there anyway. The bigger area, that's our subcutaneous area, and then the smaller area here is where we kind of prefer to give the intramuscular shots there. Again, that kind of comes down to trying to avoid valuable tissue with vaccines is what that really what we try and kind of come down to there with that. So this right here is exactly why. If you notice this off color that you see in the middle of this cut of meat right here, that is an injection site lesion. And I don't know about you guys, but think about it for a second. Would you guys like to bite into a steak that had a spot in the middle of it like that? That's the kind of stuff that we have to trim that kind of stuff out of carcasses and the like anyway, a lot of times. And so it's just one of them things we just don't want to do anyway. And this kind of even a saline solution, a sterile saline solution injected into muscle like that will leave scar tissue like that. And so we just want to try and avoid that if we possibly can. Another thing that I wanted to kind of make you think about it, this really revolves a lot back to animal handling, both while you're working your animals through your working facilities and while they're on the trailer as well there anyway, if you notice, this is what a bruise looks like on an animal after the hide has been removed. This is what they have to do to those big chunks of bruise. I wouldn't want to eat a bruise, and I probably don't think you would too after seeing that there either. And so they trim considerable sized areas out of these carcasses there anyway that, again, take away from value at the end of the day. And so we want to try and do everything we possibly can, and that comes down to not beating on our animals with sorting sticks and things like that, and trying to be careful with that, and also loading animals on the trailer. And horns are another thing. Another reason why we want to dehorn our animals is to reduce the likelihood, because those animals, as those horns get bigger, they get to understanding what they can do with them, and they can really do a number on each other with them. So kind of keep that in mind as well. Okay, so let's switch gears here real quick and kind of talk about some general kind of weaning supplement type of guidelines here. Now, this is going to depend a little bit on the size of your animals, but at a bare bones minimum, we need to have our crude protein level in our supplement that we're going to give those animals, or our overall ration for that matter anyway, needs to be at a bare bones minimum about 12% for these young growing type of cattle. And probably in many instances, that 14 to 16% area is really probably, particularly on the smaller type of calves, is where we need to be targeting ourselves as well anyway. Try and shoot for somewhere between 0.75% and 1.5% body weight kind of going into weaning. And that's going to depend a little bit if they're used to feed, and like, for example, if they've been creep fed a little bit and that kind of thing, you probably can push that envelope a little bit further. But basically, we want to get up to 1% of their body weight in supplement about as quickly as what we possibly can anyway. And then kind of slowly go up from there. And we want to, kind of on that same lines, we want to shoot for getting up to where we have a minimum of 2.5 pounds a day of gain on our animals as well anyway. That maintenance energy requirement takes up a big component of our overall energy there anyway. And so it really doesn't take that much more to go from, say, 1.5 pounds a gain to 2.5 pounds a gain anyway. And so we want to try and do that to improve our efficiency there. And Patrick, he mentioned the ionophores from the cow standpoint earlier on, and I tend to agree 100% with that anyway. We've got a couple options when we're talking about ionophores. With the two primary ones we've got are Bovitec and Rumensin that we use there anyway. Rumensin is the only one of the two that is labeled for use in a pasture environment, where Bovitec is only labeled to use in a dry lot environment anyway. But when we're weaning, obviously we've got that available, or got either option to us available anyway. Rumensin is a bit more efficient, or does a bit more for us on cattle that are on pasture in particular than what Bovitec will, and where Bovitec has a slight advantage on cattle that are on a more supplement-based type of a ration anyway. So kind of keep that in mind there a little bit anyway, but you'll see about a 10% increase, or possibly a little bit higher than that, in the feed efficiency by including that ionophore in there. And besides that, when we think about weaning, we've got a lot of animals that are congregated pretty closely together anyway. And coccidiosis is one of those type of a bugs that gives us a little bit of trouble. It's spread by birds, but when we see it in cattle, it mostly shows its head up as bloody scours is what we see anyway. But ionophores are also a coccidiostat, meaning that they will basically prevent the animals from getting coccidiosis along with that. So that's kind of an added benefit that we see out of adding that ionophore there. Okay, probably, and it's not the most efficient system, but it's definitely by far the most common system around here, I think anyway, mostly from an ease of management type of a standpoint, and the fact that we have a pretty high abundance of forage as well anyway. But we generally, what we talk about with this free choice hay and then add the supplement to it would be leaving round bales out there in hay rings for the animals to go and pick at as they choose there anyway. And the problem with that is the variability of the quality of our hay anyway. And you know, that comes down to hitting that point home about testing that hay. And we always want to save the best hay that we possibly can back for the animals that need it most. And weaning time is one of those times when we need good quality hay. And so obviously we want to try and use some of our better quality hay there as well anyway. And besides the variability of that quality, there's always waste involved too. And if you remember last week, I talked about hay waste associated with feeding and the different types of rings and everything. And so you might want to think about that and go back and look at that a little bit more, and we can talk about that if anybody has any questions too there. But again, there's waste associated with feeding anything free choice. So, okay, next thing that we've got on the list here is the bunk space that's required anyway. We want to have a minimum of about 18 inches of available bunk space for each animal that we've got in the weaning pen at a given time there anyway. A lot of times, particularly on cattle, and many times when we're weaning white, cattle have not been exposed to any sort of a grain-based feed anyway. And so for the first few days, it's not a bad idea to kind of not put an extreme amount of pressure, but kind of push them and entice them to go toward those feed troughs to be able to find that feed and start picking at it a little bit earlier, and try and help them transition to understanding that there's something good in that feed bunk to be able to eat there anyway. And besides pushing the cattle to the bunk, if you'll kind of work to place your bunks in an area that's going to be a fairly high traffic area. We like to keep bunks kind of a lot of times along the edges of our pens, and water too, for that matter, that because cattle tend to circle in there anyway, and so they're more apt to find it quickly there anyway. And I put this last little bit out of here. It's pretty important to get something in those animals' guts and keep it there anyway. If they go for 2 days more or less without having any sort of feed input into them, whether it be hay or grain or whatever, it greatly reduces the microbial population of their guts. I mean, we can get down to levels as low as 10 to 15% of what we would consider normal there anyway. And so anytime you do that, while you're adding stress, and you're going to decrease the feed efficiency and performance of that particular calf, and increase the likelihood of it getting sick too, for that matter anyway. And so, like I say, we want to try and get something in those animals as quickly as we can through the weaning process there. Other weaning considerations that we kind of want to talk about, fence line weaning. And I don't know, I'd be interested, if you don't care, if you'd hit into the chat there, I'd be interested in seeing whether any of you have kind of experimented with fence line weaning at all there anyway. If you notice in this picture right here, you've got the cows on the right-hand side of this hot wire fence, and calves on the left-hand side there. And so basically the concept behind fence line weaning is if we let those calves have some contact to where they see where mama is, why it reduces the stress on them as they wean, and kind of makes them kind of acclimate to their new lives a little bit quicker that way, and certainly with much less stress anyway. And so that's the concept that we kind of think we want to try and shoot for there anyway. Bunk broke, obviously, like we talked about that a little bit ago. That's one of the things that we want to try and shoot for through the weaning process. Water tanks is another important thing. When we're out on pasture, a lot of times it's going to be some sort of an open water tank like this, or a pond is what they're used to anyway. And so when it comes time to weaning, you're going to have to think about that and have some sort of a watering source that's going to be familiar to them while they acclimate in the weaning pens. And if you've got ball waters or flap water or something like that, a lot of times you're going to have to either take the tops off of them altogether, or do something to tie the balls back or the flaps open to where they can find that water a little bit easier in the beginning there anyway. And I put the hot wire thing on here, and again, and this picture up here kind of hits home with that, but a lot of times our young cattle wind up, particularly in the spring of the year, wind up going to very large wheat pastures where electric fence is basically all that they've got between them and wide open spaces anyway. And so if you can get them broke to a hot wire, that's something that can kind of save your tail later on too, from that standpoint, and kind of another thing for you to be able to toot your horn. And anymore, a lot of folks have rotational grazing systems, and so it's not as big of a deal as what it once was, but again, it's something that can potentially add value. And I put this in here. Anything that we can do to reduce the stress load on those animals and kind of spread it out a little bit is gonna be to our benefit as well as our animals. Okay, let's switch gears here real quick and kind of talk about some calling decisions and the like. So here's my list, my personal list, and I think it's a good one. And it's based off, a lot of it is based off of research and kind of common sense type of stuff anyway. What is that cow's job for us? Her job is to raise a calf for us every 365 days, and a calf that's acceptable to us. And so that's first and foremost. Reproductive efficiencies first and foremost on my list. And research has time and again showed that if those heifers calve for the first time by their second birthday, why they're going to be more productive throughout their lifespan anyway. And so that's one of those things when we talk about heifer development. One of those things that we want to kind of shoot for is having those heifers calve at 2 years of age, basically anyway. And as I said earlier, we really need to think about these cows as our employees. I mean, they are there to work for us. Yes, we do this mostly, or a lot of it is for enjoyment, but it is a business, and we want to try and make money at it anyway. And so sometimes you got to kind of cut the dead weight out, and that's what we're talking about with the culling type of stuff there anyway. And like I said, that cow's job, her primary job is to raise an adequate calf for us and to have a calf every 365 days, and do that without any assistance whatsoever, or with a minimal amount of assistance. We'll give them that, I guess, anyway. Provide sufficient resources for that calf to reach its genetic potential. Okay, we're basically talking about milk production there. Now, Patrick talked about how milk production really puts a hit on our maintenance energy requirements, and that's absolutely true. And so maximum milk production isn't necessarily what we want to shoot for. We want to try and shoot for optimal there anyway. And like I say, we want to try and make that meat and mesh up with our environment. And fortunately, we're in an environment where with not a whole lot of extra effort, we can have pretty good grazing for 9 or 10 months out of the year anyway. And so like I say, we can kind of push that envelope a little bit more from that standpoint, but it's really more about the quality of the milk than the quantity when it comes right down to it anyway. Okay, this kind of goes right along with that. Calf must be genetically capable to perform, meaning that cow has to have a pretty decent set of genes behind her to be able to pass that on to the calf to where the calf will perform adequately both in the feedlot and on the rail later on. And cow must maintain their body condition score in my operating conditions anyway. And, you know, that you've got to put some of the blame, if you've got a lot of them that are staying too thin too much of the year, you've got to put some of the blame on yourself and really go to kind of look internally for that. But if you've got a few individuals that are not holding up their weight from that standpoint, not doing as well as what you'd like, why it's probably not a bad idea to consider getting them out of the herd. Now, but they must not be crazy. Now, everybody's definition of crazy is a little bit different, but what I'm talking about there is none of us are getting younger and faster and able to jump higher than what we once were either. So like I say, we've got to kind of keep that in mind. And excuse me, we do have an aging population that are involved in agricultural endeavors, and so we just don't want to have to deal with idiots is what it comes down to. Okay, a few years ago when we were doing a whole lot of drought management type of meetings and kind of working away through forage shortages in the winter, even for that matter, why my counterpart Eldon Cole kind of came up with, he's the one that actually coined this term, the 4 O's of culling, and I liked it, and so I kind of took the lead from him on there anyway. These are kind of much the same type of a guidelines as that last list that I talked about there, but we've got open, old, ornery, and other. And of these 4 categories, I don't necessarily think that we need to call over one of them individually for the most part anyway, but it's kind of a 3 strikes and you're out, or a check mark type of a system there anyway. The more negatives we have, the higher toward the top of the culling list that a particular animal needs to go there anyway. Okay, open is the one of these 4 here that I consider to be the one that's of utmost importance to us really anyway, because again, this kind of goes back to what I said earlier. That cow's job is to raise a calf for us. If she's not raising a calf, if she's not bred, she's not going to raise that calf, and so that means she's dead weight for us for at least that particular cycle anyway. And so we want to try and identify those animals, and definitely they need to be in times of short forage and the like, they need to sift their way toward the top, and probably even in normal times for that matter even. We've got several methods of pregnancy diagnosis at our disposal anymore. Of course, the one that you're probably all most familiar with is rectal palpation, where a vet or some other sort of a trained technician comes out and actually sticks their arm in the cow's back end and palpates and feels and finds a calf and says, yes, there is a calf, or no, there isn't a calf, and kind of gives you a pretty decent idea of how far along that particular cow is anyway. And so if you see this chart at the bottom here, it's one that I put together kind of to help you weigh those decisions there anyway. ultrasound, it's much the same situation as what palpation is. However, we get a picture of that calf besides the simple feel of a trained technician in there. And so a good technician can give us a little bit more information out of that and get us a little bit earlier diagnosis as well anyway. The very best you're going to get with palpation is 35 days. And a lot of folks are not going to call one that short even. It's going to be more 50, perhaps even 60 days for some of them, even before they can get a good feel of that calf. Or with ultrasound, a good technician with ultrasound can get you down to the point where you're detecting those pregnancies as early as 30 days anyway. And another kind of added benefit with ultrasound is potentially with the right equipment and the like anyway, and the right timing, you can potentially detect the sex of that fetus that's inside of that cow. And you might want to use that from a marketing standpoint, like if you're selling bred heifers or something like that, for example, anyway. There could be some added value to that later on down the road too. I think the major benefit to both of these two options is the fact that it's real time. You know right then and there whether they're bred or whether they're not anyway. The last one that I put on here is the blood test. And one of the advantages to it is that it's even a few days earlier yet. At 28 days, you can get a solid yes or no, and it's very accurate too anyway. Basically how it works is it's simply a yes or no. They look for an individual protein-like substance in the blood that is present for bred cows anyway. And so that's what they're after with the blood test there. And if you see in this picture here, they pull tail blood. In my opinion, the biggest advantage to it is that I can teach anybody in a few minutes time how to pull blood from an animal anyway. And cost wise, it's going to be kind of right in line with what the others are. The biggest drawback to it is you have to send that blood off to a lab. And some veterinary offices can do this in-house now and get you fairly quick results, but it's not going to be real time, at least anyway. And if you have to send it off, well, it might be at least 2 days and potentially as long as a week, kind of the way the mail runs anymore before you get results back. And so that can be a little bit of an issue in itself there too anyway. But again, there's plenty of options available to you. And so I want you to think about that as a management decision that you ought to consider. Okay, I put this on here just strictly so you could see what pregnancy rate, how that affects our overall profitability of the operation. Now, generally speaking, when I use this slide here, why I'm talking about body condition and how reproductive efficiency goes back to body condition. And Patrick talked about that already, but I want you to look at these individual figures here. A pregnancy rate of 43%. And if you've got only getting 43% of your cows bred, you're not going to stay in business unless you've got a big, deep pocketbook somewhere. You're not going to stay in business very long doing that. And it takes 414 days to get that 43% bred. So we're behind on 2 strikes right there at that level anyway. And when we look at this down here, the calves that's weaned off of those calves, 375-pound calves at weaning. Now, granted, this is some older data, about 15 years old now, but when you spread the actual amount of income you have out over the number of cows, why that comes out to about $214 per cow exposed. Or if you look at these more reproductively efficient cows down here, where we're one side or the other 90% pregnancy rates on them, they're calving in a 365-day calving interval, right, or 364, right in line with our 365-day calving interval. And we're down here 500 and in the mid to upper $500 per cow exposed range. So more than double the amount of income per cow exposed that we've got there anyway. And I'll let you guys think about this, but what do you think the number that my wife and my banker both like to see better? Do they like to see $214 per cow exposed or $580 per cow exposed? And I like more money too, for that matter. Okay, the next one on the list here that you see is old. Now, obviously, if we have some written records to tell how old an individual cow is, that's gonna be the best way to go about doing things anyway. The semi-scientific method is actually looking at the teeth and mouthing those cows to kind of get a better idea of how many are. So basically, what we do to mouth them is we look at the number of permanent teeth in a pairs type of a setting anyway that those particular individuals have. So at 2 years old, why this first set of teeth right here in the middle will come in. Now cows only have teeth on the bottom set of gums. They don't have teeth on the top. So keep that in mind when you want to go home and do this anyway. But like I say, young cows, they start growing teeth from the inside out basically anyway, until we get up here to the point where we get a full mouth of teeth out here somewhere around 5 years old is kind of where we're going to be on that anyway. And from that point on, why those teeth start wearing down off of the tops, like what you see over here, to where we get nubbins in there. Now, you can cheat an age type of a mouthing by having good grass out there for the animals to eat, where they don't have to grub it to the ground all the time. Like I say, if they in a good managed grazing type of a system, why their teeth are going to last longer, and so they're going to mouth younger than what they actually are. So, like I say, you can kind of cheat the system a little bit with that if you play the trading cow type of a market a little bit there too anyway. But again, then you'll hear after that why you'll hear the term short and solid a lot of time. That's for those cows generally that are going to be 7 and probably 10 or 11 years old, give or take, along in there anyway. Broken mouth, you'll hear that, and that's typically associated with cows that are over the hill where they've lost some teeth. You notice these teeth here, this one, she's actually lost teeth altogether there anyway. So keep that in mind as well anyway, and that can kind of give you an idea of how old your cows are there as well. Ornery, and now again, this kind of goes back to that crazy we talked about earlier on. Now, I put pictures of 2 different cows up here. Both of these cows are going on 14 years old now, and they've both been very productive cows, is why they've stayed in my herd for as long as what they have anyway. This particular cow on the left there, I put her and took her picture, and she's one of them. She's kind of ornery because she's always one that smells a rat, and she's the last one to come in, and she can blow up your plans to gather cattle if you've got that on your mind. She's, like I say, she's a wise old cow, and so I put her under ornery, but I'm not going to call her strictly because of that. I just kind of know that that's kind of a problem that you have to deal with anyway. This particular cow here, she'll be one of the first ones to come in, but then she better be one of the first ones that goes back out too. She gets kind of impatient, and she's been known to tear things up if you give her much of a chance as well anyway. Actually, she's one of them. She's probably gonna go to town here pretty quick. Her calf actually died. Really wasn't any fault of her own, but because of her age and all, why that's an extra strike against her at this point. Okay, then we've got several that would come under the other. Basically, anything other than those first 3 that we talked about. The ones that I consider the most important are going to be udder and feet type of issues, and how they come into play there mostly anyway. And then obviously in this part of the country, why we've got to be concerned with an animal's tolerance or susceptibility to fescue and heat. We kind of have the worst of both of those at different times of the year anyway. And I put this in capital letters at the bottom here. Basically, anything that can significantly decrease the production of that particular cow anyway. If she's not performing the way we like her to, why we want to get rid of her and find something that's gonna do a better job for us there. Okay, so I put this on here kind of to give you some thoughts about some of these things in the other column here. Now, the Hereford Association, and again, I have some registered Hereford cows. Why we have to report udder and teat scores every time that we register or report a calf being born, basically anyway. And so the udder and teat score system, it's a 2-digit scoring system. The udder score number is the first number, and then the teat score is the second number. So a top scoring female would have a score of a 99, where she has a really nice tight udder and pretty small teats there anyway. On the other end of that spectrum is a 1, where you see where that's obviously an older type of a cow in most instances anyway, where her udder's about to drag the ground, and she got some pretty large balloon type teats there as well anyway. So again, this is something you don't necessarily have to use this particular scoring system, but this is the one that's been adopted by the Hereford Association, and it's been approved by the Beef Improvement Federation as well anyway. But we want to try and shoot for having cows that have a nice tight udder to them. So basically anyway, probably a score of a 6 or higher is what we want to try and shoot for there. Certainly a 5 or higher. And then on the teat side, I personally think you can get those teats a little bit too small. I don't like them to be that small myself anyway at a 9. but we certainly don't want to have things on the other end of the spectrum as well. Anyway, there, that probably that 7 and 8 score, 6, 7, and 8 score is probably where we want to try and shoot for there. I would kind of consider these two here to be a pretty ideal type of an udder myself. Okay, the other issue, this actually comes from the Angus Association's foot scoring system here anyway, and it's a good system to look at as well anyway. From a foot standpoint, they don't take the same. They take an average number is the ideal kind of a point, I guess you'd say. It's still a 1 to 9 scale, but a 5 on both of the scores that we look at on feet is what we would consider ideal there anyway. If you notice on the claw set, why anything below 5, notice how the toes kind of sprawl out there a little bit. We don't like that. That's kind of a sign of a weak foot structure and can potentially be more apt to lead to foot issues as well. And then when we go to getting above a 5 here, you start seeing these toes really get a lot of curl to them anyway. And this right here is what we would kind of call a corkscrew type of a toe, where the toenails actually, the toes actually kind of grow in a corkscrew sort of a shape, and they get kind of weird looking layers to them that kind of looks corkscrew like, even for that matter anyway. And so we want to stay away from these extremes as well here anyway. Then from the foot angle standpoint anyway, again, ideally we want to have this foot angle be basically the same as what the pastern is there anyway, and probably be somewhere close to a 45, and should be similar to what the shoulder angle is as well on the animal. We want to have a nice deep heel on them is what we want to try and shoot for there, but we don't want to get too out of line either where they're too straight in the front legs there anyway. Like I say, this is what we would consider the ideal type of a foot angle right there. If you go to getting where they've got a really shallow heel like this, well, you tend to have toes that will grow out and become longer like that and be issues as those cows get to be older anyway. And so we want to try and stay away from this extreme here for certain too. Okay, I felt like if we were going to talk about calling decisions, why perhaps we should talk about recruitment as well anyway. And I thought this was a good way to kind of introduce Wesley's topic that he kind of talked about earlier on about the keeping and raising your own heifers as opposed to buying replacements anyway. Through the university, we have a really good heifer development program that's got a track record of about 25 years now anyway, that called the Show Me Select program, where basically it kind of the key components of that Show Me Select program revolve around taking pelvic areas and reproductive attract scores, trying to find those early maturing type of females and those that have a large enough pelvic area to be able to hopefully have a calf on her own is what we want to try and shoot for that. And we, along with that, while we have an early pregnancy detection that goes along with that, it's a requirement that these females have to have a pregnancy detection by 90 days after the start of the breeding season anyway. And so that early preg check there, why if they come up open, that gives us the opportunity that heifer is still young enough that we can finish her out or sell her to somebody who will finish her out and make her way into comb and meat channels really easily that way anyway. But like I say, whatever your plan, I would encourage you to kind of take some planning toward whether you buy them or raise your own anyway. See to it that you're picking the right animals for to be your replacements there. And the genetic component, we can take DNA samples to help to get a genomic evaluation that can kind of help us do a better job of making those selections as well anyway. There's a lot of cost associated with this, and that's what Wesley's going to talk about, the cost associated with developing heifers anyway. And so we want to pick those animals that are going to be the best for us, so we don't have so much cost in so many animals there anyway. So kind of from a nutritional standpoint, we're taking this a little bit kind of one step further. And again, this will be something we hit on more next week, but we've got about 7 months from the time that we wean that animal until the time she's breeding. So ideally, the magic perfect number is 205 days of age at weaning anyway. And so that corresponds to roughly 7 months. And then to be able to calve by the time they're 24 months old, while we have to breed them at around 14 months. So again, like I say, we've got roughly 7 months there to be able to get those heifers to a stage where we want them to breed. We want them to be That breeding time, we want them to be somewhere between 55 and 65% of their anticipated mature weight. And that kind of comes down to economics and the value of those bred heifers a little bit there, which end of the equation. You know, when feed is high and we want to truly put a larger emphasis on reproductive efficiency, while we'll shoot toward the lower end of this mature weight, and only pick those heifers that are truly reproductively efficient early matures and are more apt to breed on time for us anyway. Where when the value of bred heifers is super high, like what it was here 5 or 6 years ago, why we want to feed, it's worth it to put a little bit more feed to those so that we have more bred heifers to be able to sell. So like I say, kind of pencil that out for your individual operation and think about that a little bit. But that's kind of the common range where we consider ideal anyway. But this really kind of comes down to shooting for a fairly moderate 1.5 pound a day gain in there to be able to get the type of weight on these heifers that we need to have them at to ensure that they're cycling properly and everything anyway. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more next week, but I wanted you to be thinking about that. And this was a pretty good way to introduce Wesley's topic as well. And that's where I'm going to end for the night. Does anybody have any questions here real quick before we move on to Wesley's talk?
Andy, you did have one question that said, at what age to wean is best?
The magical research number is 205 days. Now, I personally feel like you've got to kind of take into account your forage base there a little bit too. Anyway, you know, we can wean these calves as early as 100 to 120 days of age in an emergency setting if we have to be able to take that extra lactation component out of the cow's nutritional requirement. Again, that's not something that we would want to do under normal circumstances. But on the flip side of that, you know, if you've got quite a little bit of grass out there and your cows are in pretty good shape, why you may be able to put that off to 10 months of age, even for that matter. But the kind of the unwritten and really written kind of formal example is 205 days, which is roughly 7 months of age, is kind of the where we want to shoot for anyway. Does that make sense?
That was the only question I saw for you, Andy.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we'll turn it over.
Can you hear me okay? Andy, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought I wasn't coming through. Okay.
Yeah. You should be good to go, I think.
All right, you can see my screen okay?
Yeah.
All right, you did have a few people mention in there that I think there was 3 people mentioned that they had the experience with fence line weaning and it worked pretty good. So real quickly, I'm not going to take a whole lot of you guys' time because I know we're all already almost to 9 o'clock, but Patrick did ask me to talk a little bit about the economics of weaning calves as well as the economics of purchasing versus raising your own females. Again, we introduced ourselves last week. One of the things I would say is, in addition to the cow herd, we do wean and background our calves, and so some of the stories probably that I'll share real quickly are from some of the mistakes that we have probably made or things that we've had happen. And so if you think about it, you know, I've been with Extension almost 20 years, and one of the things that I always track is this difference between the price levels of different weight categories of calves. So, you know, the very top line there is the price category of a 3 to 4 weight. The orange is 4 to 5, and then on down the line. And a lot of what we get when we start talking about whether we should wean our calves is some of this description about what that value is actually worth. And so when you think about what buyers, you know, how do buyers decide what they're going to pay for your cattle? Well, ultimately, it comes down to 2 things. It comes down to what price they think they're going to be able to sell them for whenever they get to the next weight, and what it's going to cost them to get there. And I would actually include in that cost is the health of them, whether they're going to get sick or not. So essentially, those 2 things are what they value, you know, what they can afford to pay for your cattle. So if you think about it, if a 500-pound calf today is bringing $2 a pound, and you're going to put another 100 pounds on that calf and sell it for 600 pounds for $1.80, you know, is that value of that 100 pounds of gain the $2 that he's worth today? Is it the $1.80 that he's going to be worth when he's 600 pounds? Is it the average of the two, $1.90, or is it 80 cents? Well, when you do the math, it's actually 80 cents. And so everyone on this call just already knows more than 90% of producers, because everyone always says, oh, well, calves are bringing $1.80 a pound, so that's another $180 in my pocket. No, it's not, because we have a little something called a price slide. And what determines that price slide, really, it varies by the season, it varies by the weight of the cattle, but the biggest thing is the cost of gain, with specifically the price of corn. What corn is costing, whether it's high or low, has a lot to do with that price and that value of that gain. So, this was just a slide. A couple months ago, we did a stocker backgrounding class, and at that time, I pulled the difference between a five weight, a 573 pounder, and a 670 pounder, and that that gain was only worth 67 cents a pound. Now, interestingly enough, that was in the spring, whenever they were buying cattle accordingly. Flash forward to last week, I pulled last week's weekly market summary, and right now the difference between a low 5 weight and a low 6 weight is actually $1.24 a pound. So they're paying a lot more for the additional weight right now than they were back in the spring, and that's fairly common as you think throughout the year. Again, this is the price categories for the different weight categories in the decade right before I started. As I said, I started with extension in May of 2001. And for the last decade of the 90s, we had a very consistent price pattern. Pretty much everybody calved in the spring and weaned calves in the fall. And there really wasn't that much difference. Very few people actually weaned their calves at home. Most of them were weaned on the trailer on the way to town, and we had this very, very consistent price patterns of the calves would hit their high in the spring when people were wanting to turn them out on grass, and they would hit their low in the fall. So we could pretty easily put that into what is the value of gain for different months, and even chart that. And if you charted here, you could see that the value of gain actually was working out through that decade for about 50 to 60 cents a pound on average, but it had a lot of variation throughout the year. The lowest time for when the market paid the least for that gain was during the summer, and in the fall to winter months is when they paid the most. And if you think about it, that kind of made sense. When grass is growing and gain can be put on those animals cheap, the market doesn't have to pay as much for those. Versus when it gets wintertime and we run out of grass, then suddenly that gain is worth a whole lot more and the market has to pay more. So, the marketing plans became really easy when you're faced with this kind of a price pattern. For the first few years that I started, it was essentially, if you're a spring calver and you go in here in this fall, you can wean these calves and take advantage of higher values of gain than you will throughout the year. Flash forward to the next decade, from basically 2000 to 2010, the market paid a little bit better for that gain. Still paid the most for the lighter weight calves, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. But it was somewhere around that 70 cents per pound of gain was about what the market typically paid. The price patterns, we started getting a little bit of separation from just spring calving. We were getting some fall calving people. People were doing a little bit more backgrounding and stocker systems in a little bit different ways instead of just sticking them in the feedlot. And so we got some interesting things happening there. We got some really flat price patterns for the 350 to 4, the 450 to 5, and the 550 to 6. They kind of got really flat patterns versus the heavyweights went through their kind of normal low in the spring and then kind of went up to the fall, to where it really kind of made that middle of the summer value of gain more valuable than it had been in the previous decade. And we really kind of developed this September drop dead date. Basically, you needed to get your cattle marketed by that September time frame, or else you started getting into these really low periods of values of gain. But for the most part, the summer paid a little bit better than it had the previous decade. However, realize when we talk about averages, there's always extremes above and below. So if you think about the value of gain, what could make, the value of gain really, really low in November of 2003 to go to really, really high in April and May of 2004. What could possibly cause that? Well, does anybody remember a stumbling Holstein cow that was on the news a whole lot in December of 03? Well, BSE hit and it affected the markets. What could do the same thing in August and September of 06? That one, maybe not as much as you might remember, but that was when the ethanol boom first created, and we suddenly found out that we had 1 million acres of corn less planted than we thought we did, and it caused the markets to do some crazy gyrations there for a few months. And so economists, we tend to call these things exogenous variables or external factors, meaning basically it's outside of our control. It's really nothing within our market, but things like a China trade war or some of these things will come in and totally affect the prices that we receive for a short period of time that we did not expect. So realize one of these quotes that from a soccer operator is, you can make money 5 out of 6 years and then you can lose it all in the 6th when the market tends to go against you. Go back to this now, the last decade I want to describe, for 2010 to 2020 essentially, and our prices changed once again. So remember that really flat pattern that we'd had for some of these lighter weight categories? Well, once again, they kind of went back to, they really have spiked up when we hit grass fever in the spring and dropped when we first started through the spring and then the summer months. But then we kind of hit this low, not in the fall, but in the middle of summer. And if you look at the 6 to 7 weights being the yellow line and the blue line, the 7 to 8, they kind of give us a differing pattern, that the 6 to 7 kind of became that sweet spot, that anytime you can get that up to a 650-pound calf at no matter what month it took you, as long as it was during this time frame, you did well, versus the 7 to 8 weight, the later in the year you got, the better. And so when you think about what that did to our values of gain, and we, as Andy said, we'll talk more about this next week when we get to the stalker standpoint. I won't spend a lot of time on it tonight, but to just real quickly show you that the average values of gain are a lot higher now than that they had been in previous decades. So now only the 850 to 950 pounder is below $1 essentially. Well, the 650 I guess is just barely, but for the most part, the market's been paying us $1 a pound for that gain. And then when you look at those lighter weight categories, the 350 to 450 and the 450 to 550 has been paying substantially even better than that. And before I go on, this is one of the things that I will say is, you have to look at, whenever you're looking at, will the market pay me to wean and background my calves? I'm going to tell you right now, if you can add value to them at all, anything below about a 500 to 550 pound calf, the market pays pretty good for those lightweight calves to get them up higher. And one of the things I think that we miss a lot in our management practices is, like right now, the cull cow, Andy talked about cull cow market right now is stronger than it normally is this time of year. And there's several reasons why that is. Well, the main reason is people are eating at home where they use a higher percentage of hamburger than when they eat out. So we're eating more hamburger now, as well as we have overly fat steers in the feedlot that we need to use those trimmings for. But the cull cow market's really high right now. What a lot of people will do is they'll wait till their normal weaning time period and wean the calves. And if they, for some of those lighter calves that come in at 375 pounds or something like that, they just take what they get. But I'll tell you, we're missing a real opportunity right now to go ahead and early wean some of them smaller calves that the cows really aren't pulling their weight, and put wheels under those girls while the cull cow market's good, and then put those guys in a lot and feed them like they need, that they haven't been getting from mama, and help get them up to that 500 pound weight category that the market really wants. The market's paying you pretty good on those smaller calves. But the other thing I wanted to throw in here is to just describe a little bit of the transitioning that we're seeing in the markets. So if I look at the value of gain on the different weight categories, the blue bars being from 2005 to 2010, the orange bars being 2011 to 2014, and the gray 2015 to 2018. Well, what you can see on all of those categories, but especially the smaller ones, but all those categories, the value of gain whenever we went from a time period, the blue bars, where corn was cheap. And when corn got high from 2011 to 2014, our value of gain had to go up. Okay. It cost more to put that gain on. So the markets basically said we have to pay more for that. The cost of gain's higher. So we equate what the value of gain is to that. When corn went almost $6 a bushel, our value of gains jumped up. But now look at your gray bars. After we went through that period where corn has now went back down, our value of gains have stayed strong. Why is that? One of the reasons is, and again, we'll talk more about this next week, but we've had some structural shifts in our livestock industry. And we've basically incentivized more taking those calves, putting them back out on grass and growing them bigger, rather than taking that calf straight from the cow and pushing him into the feedlot and pushing as much corn through him. Now, instead of one pen rider for 2,000 head, there's one pen rider for 20,000 head, and they don't want to deal with those bawling sick calves. And so the industry has kind of shifted and pushed more of that risk versus reward back on us as producers. They want us to do that here on the farm, but they're also rewarding us with a higher value of gain today. And if you look at it, we now are back in that pattern where, yes, the summer months in the middle are basically the lower values of gain, and the winter being the higher, but it's still all basically $1 and higher for those lighter weight categories, which is really, really pretty good. But again, think about these winter months, and this makes a difference for whether you're a spring calver or a fall calver. But think about these winter months. Does it pay me to put additional weight on calves? And what do we have that everyone else would like to have in surrounding states? We have a forage that we can grow and stockpile, except for, it depends on where you're at in the state of Missouri. Southwest Missouri, we've kind of struggled this fall trying to stockpile fescue because we just haven't had the rain. But in normal years, we can grow a lot of fall forage and put cheap gain on those calves through that forage and do it cheaper than the feedlot can. Okay. Now, remember those exogenous variables that I mentioned. Always be careful of the year. I remember exactly 2015 and some discussions my wife and I were having here in October, that I was going away to a meeting, and I said, when I get back, I think we need to wean our calves. But I said, I'm going to warn you. Again, I'm a market analyst, and I felt like the market was very, very volatile. I felt like the bottom was about to fall out of the market in 2015. And very seldom can I call it perfectly, but I called it that year. So we came home, and instead of weaning those calves on the trailer, we put them in the pen. And I told my wife, I said, I think we're making a mistake financially, but we're doing what's right for the cattle. Well, look at the difference between October 23rd, 2015, and 45 days later, December 18th. Basically, every weight category had lost 50 to 60 cents a pound. So basically, think about the profitability of it that year when the calves are worth 50 cents a pound less than whenever you weaned them. You couldn't put enough gain on them to make money on that deal. But that was a fluke deal a year when the market did go against me. So don't ever say that it can't. But on average, the market is tending to pay us better for that risk and reward for doing that. Now, Andy kind of mentioned this, everyone always wants to talk about the premiums. Is the market going to pay me a premium for this? This is some of the Superior Livestock, they were some of the first ones kind of calculating the premiums, and they weren't very much until you hit about 2001, and then they kind of started increasing. A couple years ago, they redid that study, and basically this bar all the way over on the right is for non-weaned, non-shots calves at average. They've got almost 1 million head that they've calculated here, and it was about an average of about $1.49 for those unweaned, unshots calves, versus weaned and specifically weaned 45 days, about another $5 or $6 a hundred on that. So, you think about that, that's somewhere over the time period there, it ranged from anywhere from a premium of $4 to $7. So a premium of $20 to $40 a head. Is that enough premium to justify that, to justify going through that? One of the things, when I was preparing for this, I read a lot of farm journals and newsletters. I happened to come across Daryl Peel from Oklahoma State. He's a market economist that puts out a lot of these, and he'd put out this article last week called How to Add Value to Your Calves This Fall. And one of the things that he was mentioning was that right now the discounts for a bull calf weighing 450 to 550 is about $62 a head. Horns are costing about $3 a hundredweight. So thinking about something that Andy just said about the idea of weaning or taking the horns off and castrating those bulls as early as possible, even if you don't want to go through the process of weaning, simply having a vet come out and take the testicles off those calves is worth more probably than the weaning process is. So at a minimum, do that. But one of the things that Daryl reported in his article was right now the premium for weaning for steers is about $49 a head, he said. Heifers was about $35. I thought it was interesting. He quoted the last 5 years average for their Oklahoma Quality Beef Network sales. And so they have, kind of like Andy mentioned, the Show Me Select heifer sales here in Missouri. They have steer and heifer sales for feeder calves that they do in Oklahoma. And for the last 5 years, the premiums for steers for the 4 to 5 weight, it's been about $20. For the 5 to 6, it's been about $12. For heifers, 4 to 5, $12, $13, and 5 to 6, $12. So again, somewhere in that $10 to $12 range. But one of the things that this really highlighted for me is that was calves in their special Oklahoma Quality Beef Network. Because the reality is, I can tell you, if you wean and precondition your calves, there is definitely value added there. The calves get sick less, they have better feedlot performance, all of that stuff. But the reality is, do you capture that value? And one of the biggest things that you have to think about if you're going to do this is, how do I have a good enough reputation to capture that? Or can I put them through some type of certified type sale? Because we've all sat in the sale barn, and this is where people get the idea that maybe weaning calves they're not really paying us for it. We've all sat in the sale barn and heard people say, oh yeah, weaned and shots. But there's no documentation to back it up. We don't really know if that really is true. And unfortunately, the buyers, if they don't know that's true, they don't pay more for it either. So do you have a reputation with your sale barn and that they will actually talk up your cattle and really point out that these cattle have been vaccinated, have been weaned? Because there is value created, but oftentimes I don't think we capture that value. And Andy already mentioned this study, the Hilton study, where they had 11 years of this. And he's absolutely right. The average profit over that time was about $69. And the premium from preconditioning ranged from a negative $3.50 to a high of $11.36 a hundred. But the difference is 63% of that profit came from that additional weight that was put on the calves. So, we think about this. We think about, is the market going to pay me for this? It's not the premium necessarily that I need to be focused on. Back to what I was saying about those lighter weight calves, can I put additional weight on that the market wants me to put on to get those calves to the heavier weights that the market really wants? The problem for this is from our Census of Agriculture, and essentially 2/3 of our beef producers are over the age of 55. And I will argue a lot of us on this call may be in that younger third, but we also have off-farm jobs, which makes it difficult to have time to be able to do this, as well as the reality is farming is not our primary source of income. Okay. So how many people have one of these? There's a reason why that discount on those bull calves is $62, but there's a reason why when you go to the local sale barn that sometimes it seems like there's just as many bull calves sold as there are steers, because of the older population that we still have a lot of cattle, and they simply don't have the facilities to vaccinate them and take care of them like they need to. This next picture is a picture of my corral after I'd put 100 head of calves in there, and you see what happened. They busted through it. The Tucker facilities aren't always the best. This is not just a hanging sign. If you can see my cursor sticking out there, that is the part of the panel that just busted when the calves got out onto grass. And so a lot of us don't have the facilities that we need to do that. But Andy mentioned, fence line weaning. This is not a picture of a fence line weaning. I stuck it in there. Those aren't even my cows across the fence. But I stuck this picture in there to remind me to mention this. The reality is fence line weaning cost about a roll of polywire and some step-in post. It's really pretty inexpensive to do that, to put up electric fence along the fence. And I've done it with a very, very poor barbed wire fence. One wire of electric fence down through there oftentimes can hold 98% of the calves in. And then guess what? A couple of the calves did get through, so I just ran them into the corral and locked those two up. But the other thing to think about too, if you really want to cheapen this up, is if you got to put something in the dry lot, if you can put the cows in the dry lot and leave the calves out in the pasture where they've been raised for the last couple of weeks, will go a long ways to keeping their stress level down. But the economics of that ends up being a lot better. Again, I don't want to keep you guys real long, but you guys heard me talk a little bit of last week to think about the idea of what am I going to feed 365 days a week, 365 days a week, I'm sorry. 365 days a year. For the most part, the way we've done this growth curve is we've harvested a lot of hay here and fed it out in the winter. The reality is you're going to get tired of me asking you this question because I'm going to ask it again next week. But what is your system for how you utilize that grass? Because the reality is more profitable people are figuring out, I lower this requirement with a few less cows, and then I come in with a backgrounding program when I have this excess grass. Because I am not necessarily even saying the stocker enterprise has to be that much more profitable than the cow-calf enterprise, but it can be used as the mechanism for using this excess grass. Again, what do we have that everyone wants? You know, thinking about this also affects, I'm trying to go fast now, but this also affects the idea of fall versus spring calving, how you use that for your growth curve. But, you know, when I think about, is the market going to pay me to wean and background my calves? There's only two reasons really economically that cause that to happen. One is, can I do it cheaper than the market? And the reality is, if I'm going to have to do that on stored feed, I can't, because the feedlot who buys feed by the hundreds of semi loads a year can always buy feed cheaper than I can. But if I have that grass that the feedlot does not have, maybe I can put it on cheaper. Often I can't. But what I can do is take those calves and add some value to them by weaning, giving them shots, and preconditioning them, making them worth more down the road. And again, maybe I don't make all the money on the premium from that. When I say the premium of a wean versus an unweaned calf, but when I put that gain on those lighter calves that are making the difference between a 375 pound calf and a 450 pound calf, and the market's paying me $1.50 to do that, that tends to be a pretty profitable enterprise then. I'll often, people want to talk about trying to background those bigger calves, but the lighter ones, if you can turn those calves around, the ones that the mama hasn't been doing it, goes a long, long way. But the last 2 points on this slide that I really want to make is that the calves need to become part of your drought mitigation plan so that I'm not overstocked with too many cows, but that the calves become that cushion, that barrier. And then I'll also say it's because it's the right thing to do. I'll be honest with you, I wean my calves whether it's profitable or not, because I think it's the right thing to do for them, to set them up so that they don't get sick down the road. The last thing on earth I want to do is send calves that I've spent, a year and a half in the making from the time that they were conceived to the time that I wean them, and then watch them go on to the next leg and die because they get sick. Now, real quick, again, I wish I'd have had more time. I'm going to beat up on Patrick and Andy and make me not have to go last next time. But the idea of this raising versus purchasing replacement females, and again, I think this is one of those that, anytime you ask an economist a question, they're going to say it depends. And this is a tough one because I usually let people vote. And it's interesting. You guys were dead heat. There were 8 people saying to buy and 9 people saying to raise until I asked for those last 3 people that came in, and they all said raise. So it ended up 8 said buy and 12 said raise. And the reality is, there is no right answer. If you guys are looking for me to tell you which way it is, there is no right answer because every farm is different. See, the reality is every one of your farms has a limited amount of grass, has a limited amount of time, and a limited amount of money to spend. You can only feed so many mouths, and you as yourself can only take care of so many animals, and you only have enough money to go around. Now, you can argue to me, okay, I can buy more feed, I can hire someone to help me, and I can borrow more money. but all of those come at a cost. Okay, all of those come at a cost. So how am I going to allocate my limited feed, time, and money among the enterprises in my operation, among the cow herd, among the replacement females, and among the calves to be backgrounded? Okay, so you might surprise you, but the second highest input into our budget is the replacement cost. Feed costs from last week, we talked about feed cost being the highest, okay? The second highest variable is replacement costs. Just simply thinking about if I'm going to have to replace 10 to 15% of those females each year, what that costs me. And, you know, our human nature, when we think about saying, well, is it cheaper to raise or buy? A lot of times people automatically say, well, you know, what I have in what I have, I can keep, and I don't put much cost into there versus having to buy something that was worth twice as much. But I would really, if I had everybody in the room, I'd love to spend some time talking about this. Do you know what it really cost you to develop a heifer from weaning to preg check? Because I'll tell you, for most people, it's a lot more than we really think it is when you actually sit down and calculate it. But these are just a few of the things that goes into that. You know, the idea of cash flow. If I give up a heifer calf that I could sell this year for X amount of dollars income versus I'm not going to get income at all out of that animal for the coming year versus going ahead and selling her for what I get out of her and buying a third period animal that's going to give me income in the next year. Also realize the timing. There is 365 days or more from the time I make that decision to whenever I get something out of that, and actually more when you think about from the time I sell her calf. So when you think about that, you know, think about coming out of 2015. If you had a very expensive calf and you held to then a year and a half later, the calf that you were selling out of her was worth a whole lot less. So a lot can change in that year and a half in between there. Some people make this decision based on a health concern, you know, a closed versus an open herd, that I don't want to bring, you know, potential replacements in that could have other viruses and bacteria that my animals are not adapted to. You know, the genetic base. What is your genetic base? Do you feel like you have superior genetics compared to what you can buy? You know, the number one statement most people make that raise their heifers say, well, this one is adapted to my environment. If she's excelled in my environment, I know hopefully her offspring will do better than something that I potentially bring in. Also, you know, when we talk about selecting heifers, one of the things we say is, Andy just said, those that breed early in the breeding season tend to have more calves long term. You have no idea the exact age of a heifer that you're buying, whether she was bred, whether she conceived in the first half of the breeding season, or whether she conceived actually 6 months late. You don't know based on what you're being presented. However, I'll throw the flip side to it. For those of you that are raising your replacement females, you have to use calving ease genetics sometimes for those. And this idea of the trade-off versus maternal genetics versus terminal. You know, if you are using calving ease bulls and then you're raising heifers out of those calving ease bulls, that tends to become a compound effect on weaning weights and tends to lower weaning weights. There's a lot of advantages to just buying all your replacements and only using terminal genetics from then on, you know, not worrying about having to use maternal bulls, as well as how many bulls do you need? You know, this, if you're someone that's got 700 to 800 cows, then maybe you can have some bulls that are maternal bulls and some bulls that are terminal. But for most of us, you know, we don't have those numbers. And so the idea of having to keep separate bulls to keep some of those separate lines, that doesn't work. And so we end up watering down maybe the production that we could get if we just focused on terminal genetics. Some people talk about, well, I want to expand my herd quickly, or maybe I want to change my calving season. Well, if you're wanting to change your calving season, often it's easier to go buy the calving season that you want to change to rather than trying to raise animals to fit that, because they're not in that system now. You know, can you, when I say performance, can you develop your heifers better on your farm or worse than the next guy? You know, maybe there, I could do this as a plus or a minus depending on how you look at it. Some of us don't have the time and labor and the pen space and all of this to feed our heifers the way they possibly should be. So maybe we don't develop them as well as we could. Versus, do we really know when we're buying that animal that it has been treated the way we want it, or has it been put in a feedlot and fed silage the majority of its life, so that when it shows up here, it's not going to be adapted to my fescue, or that people have masked a lot of the development symptoms with additional feed. Cost, thinking about the group size, has a big difference there. Again, I've heard people say anyone with less than 200 cows can't economically raise their own heifers. I'm not necessarily going to agree with that, because I think it depends how you're raising them. Again, if you're raising them the high input system like some people do, versus if you're going more of that low input system that Andy just talked about, maybe shooting for maybe a smaller mature size and trying to make them a little bit more focused on reproductive performance to see which ones will conceive without me pampering them. But definitely when you think about cost, we have fixed cost on the farm in general. And so if let's say I didn't raise my own animals and I went and bought only productive cows, so all my cows in my system were what I call productive, meaning they're going to have a calf for me. So I'm spreading my fixed cost over only productive assets. My cost is lower versus if I'm spreading some of my fixed cost, over the productive cows as well as these heifers over here that aren't going to give me anything for a coming year. So that's something to keep in consideration. Taxes, I don't have time to go into that, but the idea, the difference between income taxes versus capital gains. If I sell, just real quickly, if I sell a heifer for $600-700 and I'm making money on the farm, well, I'm going to pay income taxes on her as well as probably self-employment taxes. And if I'm drawing my Social Security before my full retirement age, I may have to give some of my Social Security back if I make too much. Versus if I take that same heifer and I make her a cow, now she becomes what we call capital gains, which is not subject to self-employment taxes. It's not subject to Social Security recapture, things like that. So there's a lot of tax games that we can kind of play in this versus maybe alternatively, maybe I need a big deduction this year. So when I buy those replacement heifers and spend a lot, maybe I need that Section 179 deduction this year. So depending on your tax situation, I'll throw out just real quickly this idea of replacements. We talk about the idea of raising your own replacement heifers versus buying third period heifers. Does it have to be heifers? Does it have to be heifers? Some people will say the best way I'm going to get around this is I'm never going to calve out another heifer, so that I don't want to deal with that, because we know that heifers, have smaller weaning weights typically. So some people will sell all their heifer calves and only buy, 5 to 6 year old cows. Some people even go buy open cows. Some of the most profitable people I've seen, they only buy wet bag cows. So cows that they can see are coming into the sale barn that are thin, they are open. They don't want to buy a fat open cow, but a thin open cow that's got a wet bag means she's just weaned off a calf and she's put all of her heart and soul into that. So they buy some of those cows, and they say they're almost like the mongrel dog from down the street. Somebody else has abused those girls, and so they bring them into their own operation, give them a little bit of feed like they should be taken care of, and suddenly they respond like you're their favorite master, and they perform well for you. So there's lots of different strategies that you can do on this. But I hate to give Iowa State too much credit, but they really do. Lee Schultz and Patrick Gunn have a couple of really nice spreadsheets out there. Up here in this upper right-hand corner, you can see there are a couple of Excel spreadsheets. And one of those spreadsheets is from the standpoint of that I typically raise my replacement heifers. So what do the costs need to be to make it break even for me to start buying them? The other one is from the opposite, saying I typically buy my replacement heifers. Now what do the costs need to be for me to make it break even to raise mine? And so they're kind of neat tools. I would encourage you to go out there. All you got to do is Google Iowa State raising versus buying heifers. A couple of neat spreadsheet tools. Other universities have them as well. The University of Missouri's, I just looked, is down. We had one, but it's not up there right now, so I couldn't show it. But those are kind of nice, neat tools. But as a closeout, as I said, you're going to get tired of me asking you this question. What is your system? But again, I told you I read a lot of articles and read a lot of newsletters. And you know, this one was came out just about a month ago by Jordan Thomas, who is on the University of Missouri campus. He wrote this article called "Selecting Replacement Heifers Shouldn't Happen at Weaning." And it's a really interesting article that he talks about the idea of we don't at weaning should not select our replacements. We should select heifer candidates, which basically means we keep at weaning a large group of heifers. We get rid of all the really too big and the really too small dinks, and we keep a group of what we call heifer candidates, and then we put them into the breeding program, and we do a very, very short breeding program, very short breeding program. Can you even get it too small? Maybe it's just one AI and see who conceives from that one timed AI, or maybe it's a 30-day breeding program, but you do a very, very short breeding program and you see who excels in that, and those become your replacements. Because you know what? I go back to this question here. We all have limited feed time and money. Who's going to get that? You know, in all honesty, probably the most profitable system that I can design is one where each one of these gets a piece of it as part of our drought mitigation plan so that we can reduce numbers if we need to. But I will tell you, we're going to talk more about this next week. The idea that if I keep more heifers than I need, more times than not, if I do a very short breeding program, the ones that come up open sometimes make me a whole lot more money even than the ones that actually breed. That sounds bad, but because it goes back to heifers don't have the price slide nearly as rough as steers. And so those, if I do this in a short enough window where I can preg check those heifers quickly and get them right back into a feeder program, often I make really good money by that, what I call a stalker heifer system for those girls that don't breed. Say my genetics are better than I think, my reproductive performance is good, and I get additional heifers bred than I need. Well, that's not a bad thing either, because that can become one of these enterprises that I can sell additional bred heifers to someone else if I've got more than I need. But the idea of building this system where I don't base it just on the cow-calf program, but I build some of these additional enterprises in there, can be advantageous. So I'm sorry I did not tell you exactly which is the most economical, whether it's to buy or raise your heifers. And the reason why I did is because it really will be a different answer for each and every one of you. It really will. But based on your feed resources, based on your genetics, based on your labor, and how much time you have, each one of us can come up with a system I think that is most profitable overall. And I don't want you, if you are going to raise them, back to what I just said, I don't want you saying, okay, I'm going to go out and pick the prettiest heifers at weaning time, and then I'm going to breed them for the same 90 days that I breed my cows. No, let's pick more than that, and let's let Mother Nature and breeding select the ones that are going to be the best for us long term. And in the meantime, we make a little bit of money on the ones that don't even breed because of the way the value of gains that we're going to talk about next week work. With that, is there any questions?
I don't see any in the chat. So are there any questions for anybody this evening? Any of the speakers? Well, again, thank you all for being on tonight. I'll send out a survey tomorrow. I sent one out. It's either yesterday or today. Had an issue with the survey for last week, and somebody let me know about that, and I redid it and sent it out again. And so probably got 2 emails with a survey on that, but just look at the second one. It's the same survey. We just had issues with people providing responses. And so.
And Patrick will send out my PowerPoint as well. So
yeah, I'll do that. So Anyway, thank you all for tonight, and we'll see you next week.